All right. So we're going to learn about Express, but there's actually a lot more that we're going to learn about. But just sort of think about something for a second. Think about communication. We spoke about how you could end up encoding things, and one of the examples that we ended up doing was Morse code, right? So you could end up doing Morse code, dashes and dots, and that sort of thing. But it's probably not enough just to know the dashes and the dots, right? There's got to be some protocol so someone knows that you're done sending your messages. Or I'm assuming, I'm not a big Morse code guy, but there's some way to specify that you can be done with these things. There's some more than just knowing what the letters are that are going across the wire. Well, there's a lot of protocols that are built on top of internet communication. And when we say protocols, these are rules that are set up, ways that things have to get implemented in order for internet communication to end up working. Now, the one that we're going to be focused on is going to be HTTP. And when we think about HTTP, we can think about this is how messages have to be structured for HTTP communication. Okay? When we end up making requests for HTML pages, we make a request a certain way, we end up getting a response a certain way. And our browsers are set up to deal with that particular protocol. And our servers are set up to serve data based upon that protocol. So those are the rules of the game, but what about all these other protocols that we have here? Well, there's actually a couple of different layers that you have. So you might have heard the term TCP/IP. And, just to break it down a little bit, the Internet Protocol deals with addresses. So when you end up making a call to a server, there's some address that you're hitting. In the end, there's going to be some IP address. And so the IP protocol, we can sort of think about it as that it's going to handle the address part of the packets that we're sending over the wire. We tend to think of these things as just one big request and one big response, but that's not the way that things work out. In fact, if we end up going up a little bit further here, there's another layer here. So the IP address gets us to where we want to go. The TCP layer is dealing with packets because packets can end up getting to places in different orders. So there's another layer that determines, hey, look, here are the packets that are coming over the wire, okay? This is a complete message. It ends up putting these things back together. So you can do a lot of different types of communication over TCP/IP, but the part that we're interested in is communication of HTML. So what we're going to look at, so we have another layer, which is an application layer. And there's other application layers as well. There's rules for sending email messages. You've heard the word maybe POP, which is another post office protocol. But the protocols are layered. And the layer that we're going to look at, which is really what Express ends up dealing with, is going to be the application layer. We can sort of think about it as the rules for sending hypertext messages over the wire, making requests, two parts of it, making requests and getting responses. So it's good to have a little bit of a feel for these things. If we sort of were to go and diagram this out, what happens is that we start with a request, we make the request, the internet basically is operating over TCP/IP. We make a request that gets to our server. Our server is using the HTML protocol, it's implemented. Something on the server has implemented the HTTP protocol, which is a set of rules, and it sends back the proper response. from an HTTP perspective, even though there's multiple packets that are going on under the covers, from our perspective, the key there is one request, one response. You make a request, you end up getting a response. So when we think about protocol, we're thinking about rules. We're thinking about it's the specification, not the implementation. And protocols are often used in communication, right? I mean, you can almost think about having a conversation with someone, you know, when someone interrupts you a lot, right? Well, you could say it's an etiquette issue, but maybe they don't know communication protocols, right? They're supposed to wait for you to finish, and then they can end up talking. But these are, you know, protocols are very often used in communication. So Node's HTTP library is an implementation of HTTP. And we saw a little bit of that in the last lecture. And let's just talk a little bit about what a request ends up looking like. So here's a request that's going to go over the wire. And this is, if we ended up looking at the text of this request, we'd see a number of different pieces. So first thing we could see, if we color code this thing a little bit, is where are we going to? There's got to be a URI, an address that we're going to, and that's the URI portion of the request. That's going to be a verb. There's also headers that end up getting sent, and a body that ends up getting sent. So we'll go into these in a little bit more detail, but there's common verbs for HTTP communication. This is in the protocol. You don't have to adhere to this all the time, but it's a good practice to do, where GET is associated with reading data. A POST request is associated with creating data. Puts are associated with updating data. And deletes are associated with deleting data. Okay? We think of a CRUD application. This is the CRUD, C-R-U-D, right? This is very common, what you're doing with an application, either reading, creating, updating, or deleting. We'll find out that when we want to actually adhere the best way to the protocol, we'll find out we're going to have to do a little bit of work to actually do puts and deletes. And we'll cover that a little bit tonight. So what about the response itself? Well, the response is going to have a status. Okay? Request doesn't have to have a status. You made a request, you got a response. What's the status of that response? Number of different statuses to look at. 200 means success. This is probably the most common one that you'll end up seeing. There are also headers that could end up getting sent back. Headers could be various types of information. You could do your own custom headers if you want to. But the part of the response that we're interested in is more than likely going to be the payload or the body of the response. And from the browser's perspective, the browser is going to use this information to end up displaying your page, right? We talk about how our text file turns into a DOM, right? That's the browser that's doing that, taking this text and turning it into something that's sort of living and breathing on the client. When we think about the common statuses that you can end up getting back, most common one is OK. There's some other ones that you could end up using. When something is created, 201, and it's important to note that this is not automatic. This is up to you to decide what status to send back. Okay? So when we start looking at Express, we'll realize you're under control of the status that ends up getting sent back. So a common thing to do is created status. If a page is cached, 304 status, and your server might be handling that for you. A bad request, an unauthorized request, a not found request, and a server error. So what about Express? Well, Express is a node library that's going to be built for handling requests. handling requests, and sending responses back. Now, what I want to do here, and we're going to go into details of Express, but what I'd like to do is to do a demo to actually build a site from start to finish with Express. There's going to be a bunch of new concepts that you're going to see. There's a bunch of new modules that you're going to end up seeing. And what I would say is that probably by the end of this weekend, this will end up making a lot more sense to you. But we're going to build a site, and we're going to end up building. So one of the things that you have to realize is that a lot of the things that you're able to do with Node are not provided by Node. They're provided by third-party libraries. Node comes with some things built in. So we don't have to install anything to get the FS module. We don't have to install anything to get the HTTP module. But there's a lot of modules that don't come with Node. Basically, you get to choose what you want. Think about sort of building the building blocks that you want. Maybe you want to use Express. Maybe you want to use another web server. So there are 5 libraries that we're going to end up using for this demo that I'm going to end up doing. And we're going to build a basic, almost a CRUD site. Everything except updating. And I'll leave that as an exercise to you, for you. So here's a site that I built. This is basically what we're going to end up building. And I'm going to deploy it as well. And this, I think, is going to really dovetail nicely into our workshop. So let's just say, for the sake of argument, that I want to build a site. And let me make this a little bit bigger. So I want to build a site to talk about how much I love Node. And I'm going to keep track. So there's any number of Node modules that you can end up using. You can end up getting them if you go, there's a site called NPM. And if you go to NPM, you could start searching for different modules that you might want to use. And so I love Node so much that what we want to do is we want to keep track of modules that we like. So I only have 5 here right now. So these are the 5 modules. In fact, not coincidentally, these are the 5 modules that we're going to end up using in our application. And so I could go over here and click on one of these modules and see that I've got an Express module. Really don't have too much information here. I've got a link to the Express module in NPM. Tells me that I could create a server using middleware. And I could go back to see all my modules. And I could look at some of the other ones. We'll see that we're going to use Swig. This is going to be a templating engine that we're going to end up using. And I could even go in here and create a new one if I wanted to. I could say foo bar. And I'll save this. And I'll see that it'll end up showing up over here. And in fact, if I go back to my home page, I'll see that now I have 6 modules. And I could go down here, and if I say, hey, this was kind of silly to do, I could go in, I could delete this as well. Okay? That's what we're going to end up building. So I've got a console set up here. I'm going to call this the I Love Node demo. And I'm going to build this out. This is all recorded. Yeah. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to, first of all, I'm going to want to set the first thing you're going to want to do when you end up setting a Node site up is to have a package JSON file. So in order to get a package JSON file, by the way, notice there's nothing in here. If I do npm init, what I end up getting are some questions, tells me how do I want to name this file. I usually just end up hitting return. And as a result of that, if I do an ls, I'll see I have a package JSON file. And if I do cat, I could see what's in that package JSON file. Notice right now, it's a pretty empty file. But there's going to be a number of dependencies that I want to have in this file. There's 5 libraries that I know I'm going to need. And you don't have to do this all in one shot, but I want to get this done in a reasonable short period of time, so I'm doing it in one shot. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to end up installing those 5 libraries that I need. The way that I'm going to do it
is to say npm install Express. And I could do one library after the other. And I could say I want Express, I want Swig, I want Bootstrap, I want method override, and I'll explain what all these are as we use them. And I want body parser. These are the 5, sort of the bare minimum that I need to create an application. Now, the reason why I'm doing this is because, first of all, I need to have these libraries, okay? But second of all, when I end up creating a Git repository, I don't want to keep all these libraries in my repository. There's no reason for me to go and have someone go and download all this stuff and have to download every single library. We'll see that once I do this, and I'm going to put a little flag here that says save, and it's going to do 2 different things. It's going to go and get all the libraries. By the way, sometimes this could take a little bit of time. This is actually going to npm. It's installing these libraries. And what it's going to do first, it's actually going to create a node modules folder, and it's going to put all those libraries in. Okay? These are just node files that we're going to get to import into our project. Right, let's use a better term. Instead of importing, we'll be able to require them when we need them, because that's what we do in Node, we require. So what ended up happening when I did that? Well, first of all, I'll see that I have a node modules folder. If I go into this node modules folder, I'm going to see that I got a heck of a lot of things in there. Okay? Let me go up one spot here. Also, if I look at my package.json file, I'll see that now I've got my dependencies. Okay? So one thing that's important is that I want to save this as a Git repository. And I'm going to actually even go through that process here. But one of the things that I don't want to do, I'm going to specify git init. It's going to say you have an empty repository. And if I say git.status, it's going to tell me, hey, look, there's 2 things that you added here. You have your package.json file, and you've got your node modules folder. I don't want my node modules folder in my repository. Okay? I've got all those files. I didn't write them. If someone wants to get those files, all they need to do, in fact, just so I could show you this, if I go over here and I say rm/rf, my node modules folder, I'm going to end up getting rid of it. Don't do it. Don't do it. Okay? Now it's gone. If I go npm install, it's going to look in my package.json file, and it's going to get them all back for me. Okay? So npm install will go and install all your files that are in your package.json file. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a file called gitignore. Gitignore allows me to specify files that I don't want to have in my repository, so it won't keep on asking me about them. And I'm going to say, hey, look, you know what? Anything that starts with the word node modules, I don't want it in my repo. And I'm going to save that. And now if I do git.status, notice the difference. My node modules folder is there, but I'm saying ignore it. Okay? That's a pretty common thing to do with your repository. Okay? I'm going to go and add this in. I'll say git.add ... And I'm going to go over here and I'll say git.commit.m first commit. Okay? Now, you guys should be familiar with this already, but just in case you're not, I'm going to go into I'm going to go into Git. Right now, if I went over here and I said git.push, it's going to show me nothing. There's nowhere to push it to. Okay? So I have a Git repository that I created, but I want to have it up on GitHub. Okay? If you ever run into a problem and you do git remote -v, you'll see that nothing comes up here. And what I'm going to end up doing here, I'm going to go to GitHub. In fact, have it right here. And I'm going to go over here. I don't know why I'm not using full stacks. Silly. Using up all my bandwidth on my... all right, a little better. Okay. So I'm going to go over here and I'm going to create a repo. And I'm going to call this I love Node demo. call it whatever you want to. I mean, it doesn't really matter. I'm going to create the repo. So this says, hey, look, if you want to create a repo from scratch, you could do this on your command line, or you could do this. So what this actually does is this actually sets up the origin. This sets up what happens when you end up doing a push to GitHub. What I'm doing is I'm saying locally, okay, here's my repo, but the origin is up here on GitHub. And so now if I do this, we could go over here, and we could end up pushing this over to GitHub, and now I'm in business. You'll notice that there's no node modules folder, but that's not a problem because, in fact, if someone ends up getting this, they'll do an npm install, they could do that. And also, if I want to be nice here, which I probably do, I'm going to open up my Vim file. I'm going to open up my editor, and I'm going to add a README. And I'll go over here and I'll say npm install. Give someone some indication that that's something they need to do if they want to end up running this repo. And of course, you're probably getting familiar with this. Git.status, git.add, git.commit, git.push. Okay. So now we've got some of the basics out of the way here. Let's actually create our server. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add a file called server.js. And what we're going to do is we're going to need to bring in Express. So I'm going to go over here and I'm going to specify that here's Express, require Express. What Express allows me to do is to create an application. The way that Express is set up to build an application, what you actually do is you actually call this function that you ended up getting back from Express. Now I actually have an Express application. If you remember when I did the example with the server, okay, this is like creating a server, but nothing is listening here. In fact, if I went to run this and I say node server.js, it's going to run and nothing's going to happen. But if I go over here and I specify app.listen and I give it a port, console.log, listening on port 3000. Now if I go to run this again, you'll see that it hangs around here. It's hanging around because it's listening for requests. And in fact, if I go and open up my browser and I do localhost 3000, I'll find that I get a response back, but it's not really telling me all that much here. Now, there's two things that I want to do. I know we're going to have questions as we go, but let's just get through a little bit more of this. Some of this stuff will get answered, but just note them down, and we'll get back to them. Because I'm sure this is a lot of new stuff. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions, but I think we would end up going way too long if I take them at this point. Good? All right. So let's do a couple things here. First of all, early on in the game, I want you to think about we want to deploy this app. Okay? Since I want to deploy this app, okay, what I'm going to do here is that when I deploy this app to a place like Heroku, what Heroku will end up doing is Heroku will assign me a port. Okay? When I deploy an app to Heroku, Heroku will assign me a port, and this is how I access that port. Process environment port. Okay? Anytime that you deploy an application, you're going to get a port to deploy it on. So when I'm running locally, I can do this on 3000, but when I deploy it to Heroku, I'm going to go over here and make this dynamic. This is not going to break anything because right now this is not set. But when I deploy it, it's going to become important. And here I'm going to end up using my built-in templating that I end up getting with JavaScript to go over here and put the port in. And if I go over here and run this again, and let's set this up so that we're actually using NodeMon so that we don't have to restart every time. Okay. tells me I'm listening on port 3000, node mon is operating. Well, Express is basically just a collection of routes, okay? And all of these routes are, another term for them is middleware, okay? And it really is just a pipeline. So when you make a request, Express will go and say, all right, well, does this part of the pipeline affect this request, okay? Does this part of the pipeline handle this request? And it'll go through the entire pipeline. Now we're going to do something fairly simplistic here. I'm going to say app.get, and I'm going to go over here and put it in a function. There's three parameters that get passed here: request, response, and next. You know what you should think of when you think of next? As done. Okay? Remember when we had that done callback? We don't always need it because we're done with this request, in fact, when we end up handling it here. And I'm just going to do something very simply. I'm going to say response.send hello. Okay? Now I'm going to go back here, and I'm going to reload this, and I'll see the string hello. Now, what do I mean by a pipeline? I'm going to go up here, and I'm going to say app.get slash. And I'm going to do that. I'm not going to put anything in here. Okay? And I'm going to reload this page. And I could sit here from now until forever, and this thing is going to keep on spinning up here. The reason why it's spinning up here is that I ended up matching a route in Express. Okay? Express says, all right, well, hey, look, you told me on slash you want to call this. You're not doing anything. Okay? Now, maybe I want to do something here. Maybe I want to log something out to the console. And I could do that. Nothing wrong with that. And I could rerun this. And I'm still dead in the water. Here's my high, but nothing else happened. Okay? So with Express, I could go over here, and I could call next. When I call next, what it says is, hey, look, you're done with this part of the pipeline. You match this part of the pipeline, okay? See if you match anywhere else. And it'll end up going through to the next part that it matches. And at this point, I'm going to be back in business. So important point here, okay? Express, when you think about Express, I think about a pipeline because that's really what it is. And if I wanted every single request to use this, not just my GET request, I could go over here and I could do something like console.log request.url. And again, I got to make sure I call next. So app.use says everything, every request. If you want to do logging or something like that, every request that comes in, you're going to end up hitting this pipeline. This app.get with a slash is very specific. And if I go over here, this will end up running. I'll see my URL was the slash, okay? And that's your first introduction into middleware. Now, what I actually want to do here is I want to actually write out some HTML. Now, I could do something like this. I could do that. And if I run that, I'll get something like that. Nobody that has a web application framework is going to put their HTML like that, together like that. What they're going to use is they're going to use some sort of templating engine. A templating engine takes a template, which is some HTML and some placeholders, okay, and some data, and marries them together to produce HTML. Because the sites that you build, they're not going to be static. Okay? You don't even know what ends up going in there. Again, we could build something out dynamically like that, but that's going to be a little bit of a drag. So what we're going to use something called Swig, which is a templating engine. This, I have to say, is one of the ones that makes a little bit less sense to me than some of the other ones, but bear with me. So I'm going to require Swig. Don't forget I installed it, so I could end up requiring it. And what I'm going to do with my app is I'm going to say to my app, hey app, I want you to set a view engine. And I want you to use the HTML view engine. I'll explain what that is in a second. And now, instead of doing send, I'm going to say response.render. So Express is aware that there are templating engines. Most likely, you're going to use a templating engine. And what Express is going to do when I call render, it's going to look in a specific spot for a file called index.html. Okay? Because I specified that I'm using the view engine of HTML. And now if I go back here and I rerun this, I'll get an error message that says, I don't know what this is. Okay? I don't know what the HTML module is. So I can't even look for a file called HTML because I don't even know what module it is that you're talking about. Okay? What I have to do is I have to say, hey, look, there's a rendering engine, so I could specify there's going to be an engine in HTML, and Swig has a function called render file. Okay? This is one of those things, it's like subscribing to an event, where render file is a function. Render file probably takes two things, a file and some data, and it produces HTML. Okay? So now I've actually specified, hey, look for an extension called HTML. You're going to use the HTML, for the HTML engine to render it. You're going to end up using Swig. And now if I go back and I rerun this, I'll get a different message. And it'll say, hey, look, I tried to find this file in the views directory. That's the default behavior. And if I go back in here, I could go here and I could go in and create my views directory. And I'm going to put in a file called index.html, and I'm going to put a little code in here. And I'll put another H1 here. Okay. So now I do that, and I go over here and I reload this guy, and I see that that ends up showing up. And I'm kind of happy, right? I've got a rendering engine. I can end up rendering out HTML. I'm going to be able to pass some stuff in here. For instance, the name of the modules that I want to put in here, things that are dynamic, okay? But let's just go over here, and I'm going to change this to buy. Boy, that's annoying. Okay? Swig thinks they're doing you a favor, and maybe they are. What Swig does behind the scenes is Swig says, hey, you know what? I'm going to assume, okay, I'm going to assume that when I end up rendering that HTML file, that it's a templating engine, and I'm going to just cache the results of that templating engine. So one of the things you have to tell Swig, and this is a pretty common thing that's a little bit of a drag, is to tell Swig, hey Swig, I want to set the defaults, and this takes an object, and I'm going to say cache is false. By the way, when I do this now, it reruns my app every time it does this. So this, I wouldn't be surprised now that this is by. But now if I go over here, don't forget, the only time that your NodeMon re-renders is when you end up changing JavaScript files, not HTML files. So if I put hi back here again, I'm going to be back in business. So 4 lines of code you need to know for Swig. Take you a while to remember them. You'll do this enough, you'll remember it. Okay? Now, I'm going to cheat a little bit because I want to. This is stuff that I think we could say that we've done stuff like this before. This is going to be my equivalent of my database. I'm going to go back over here, and I'm going to say db.js. And I'm going to go in here, and this was a gist that I had here. And let's just go through and see what it does. And what this has here, this require, this module, a little bit of a weird thing, but this is a site where I'm talking about modules, but this has modules in it, okay? So this is a site about Node where I'm keeping track of modules that I like. You'll see that what I'm exporting are 5 functions here. And I actually set this up so I have the functions in line here, but it doesn't really matter one way or the other. When I call get modules, it returns the modules that I have here. When I call get module, it runs a filter and it finds the module that I'm looking for, and I'm being very optimistic that I'm going to give it an ID that makes sense. When I call create module, I'm going to just do a little bit of an error handling here, that if you don't give me a module name, I'm going to throw an exception. If you give me a module name, I'm randomly going to come up with an ID for you, and I'm going to push this module to my collection of modules. When you go to delete a module, I'm going to just take the modules that I have, and I'm going to use all the ones that I have except the ID that you passed in. This is a fake database. Okay? This is just an in-memory database that I'm creating. Nothing all that fancy, no methods that you haven't seen before. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to go back to my server page. Save this. Here's my server page. And what I'm going to do over here is instead of just rendering nothing, what I'm going to render is something called count. And I'm going to bring my DB in here. And if it's something that you wrote, you've got to do this. Okay? And I want to point out one other thing as well, but I'm going to go over here and I'm going to say DB get modules, okay, dot length. What I'm going to end up doing with this is I'm going to go over here and in my views, I'm going to put an H1 here. We love Node. What is it? I love Node, right? Let's make it I. And I'm going to go over here and I'm going to put a div in. And my div is going to be, we have information on, and you have to know the rendering engine that you're using, the templating engine that we're using. The templating engine that we're using is Swig, and when you pass data down to Swig, Swig knows this is a token that says, hey, look, I'm going to look for data that was passed. How does data get passed? Well, just the way that we did it here. We can pass whatever we want to. Whatever we pass needs to be in this second argument. So a templating engine needs 2 things. The page to render, it's going to find that by looking in the views folder, HTML. It knows the render engine because we said that the HTML render engine is going to use Swig. And this is data that we want to pass down. This is going to be dynamic data, okay, that we're getting from our database. So now if I go to run this, I'll see we have information on 5 modules. It's important to note that if I go over here and I end up viewing the source here, okay, this is what ends up getting sent back from the server. Okay? My DOM is not being manipulated. Okay? All that templating that's happening is happening in Node. It's happening on the server. It's not happening on the client. We could manipulate the client, but this is not what we're doing now. This is all Node doing its templating. So, and I should rephrase that, it's Express that's doing its templating. And to be a little bit clearer, it's actually Swig that's doing the templating. So now, once we end up having that, let's do one other thing. Now, we have a nice CSS library. We've got a beautiful CSS library. In fact, it's over here under Bootstrap, and it's in dist. And there's a nice CS library called Bootstrap CSS that could get our site looking very nice. Okay?
what we want to do is we want to be able to return this CSS file to the client. Okay? We want to use these styles. Well, how do we do it? Well, first of all, we want to use a CSS file. We need to go into our index over here, and I'm going to put in a link. And if you're using a style sheet, you have to say that you're using a style sheet, and you have to give it an href. Okay? What I'm going to do is I'm going to arbitrarily, because this stuff is in my node modules folder, anything that I'm accessing from my node modules folder, I'm going to prefix it with the word vendor. It's not mine, somebody else wrote it. And I know within my node modules folder, the path to that, I just know this because I've done this 1,000 times, is going to be bootstrapped, dist, CSS, bootstrap, CSS. Okay? Now, if I put this in here, and I end up opening up, and I do this again, I'm not going to see any change. And on top of that, if I go over here and I reload this page, I'll see that I'm going to get a 404, meaning wasn't able to find this file. Okay? Well, Express gives you a way to what are called creating static routes. A static route says, hey, look, if you come in and look for a file, go look and see if that file exists on the server. And if it exists, you return it. You don't want to make all your files available. That would be a huge security thing. You'd basically be giving up your source code, perhaps. But files that you want to serve to the client, in order to make them accessible, what we're going to do is we're going to put in really our first piece of what would be called middleware. And the way that we're going to end up doing this is we're going to say, hey, look, if a request comes in and it ends up coming in with the prefix vendor, Express allows us to create a static route. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to use another module that's going to allow me to concatenate a couple of things together. The current directory name that I'm in and the node modules folder, 1, 2, 3. And I'm going to go up here and I'm going to specify path. So all path does is that I need to put a path to this where I want this static directory to live. What I'm basically saying here is if you come in with a prefix of /vendor, I'm going to look in the node modules folder and see if I can find that file. Okay? So /vendor is arbitrary, okay? But this is a file that should end up existing on my server. Again, I use path because instead of actually going in and concatenating the names of paths, path.join says, give me some strings, and I'll create the path for you. It's a very simplistic module, but you'll end up seeing it get used. In essence, another way of putting this is that I'm mounting this for this URL. If something comes in starting with the URL, look inside of this folder and just serve the file. There's no templating, there's no nothing. Now if I do that, if I don't have an error, path is not a function, path.join is a function. Sorry about that. Try that one more time. So now you see, not a huge difference, but you see some nicer looking text. And in fact, I'm going to use a little bit of Bootstrap as I go along. This is something that you'll get comfortable with. We'll eventually end up building our own version of Bootstrap. And I'm going to go over here and do some CSS classes. Container in Bootstrap just goes and gives me a little room to work so everything's not shoved up against the edges. And in fact, Bootstrap has some nice classes. If I give it a class called well, it gives me this nice sort of gray background here. Again, just a little bit of CSS that I can use. So 2 things here. If a request ends up coming in, by the way, just realize something, that even though we didn't write this route, this route that we have here, okay, and let me use the term correctly, this piece of middleware, what it's doing is that if a request comes in, it's going to look and it's going to see if that request starts with slat vendor. If it doesn't, somewhere along the line there's a function that's getting called here. There's a function that's created. When we call express.static, remember higher order functions? We can call a function and get a function back. That's what's happening behind the scenes. Okay? And in fact, rest assured that if it can't find your file, it just calls next. Okay? If it can find your file, it reads that file and it sends it down to the client and it doesn't call next. Okay? That's how middleware ends up working. And there's 3 pieces of middleware that we're going to end up adding later on. But before we do that, let's actually create a link. And the link that we're going to do here is going to be that when we click on this link, we're going to do an href to a page called modules, to list our modules. Let's do it here so we've got a little bit more room to click. And now when I run this, I'll get this link. When I click on this link, it'll tell me that that route doesn't exist. So now let me go in and create that route. It's not going to be all that different than the route we have up here, but we have the ability to say, hey, look, when a request comes in, and this is going to be for modules, we're going to return not the index page, but we'll have a page called modules.html. And instead of actually just returning the count, we're going to just return the modules themselves. Now, if I go to run this, I'm going to get a different error, and the error is going to be, this is all nice, but I could not find this modules.html file. So I'm going to go in, and I'm going to cheat a little bit by going in here and copying this and calling it modules.html. And what I'm going to end up doing here, just so I can link my pages together, I'm going to call this modules. I'll put a link back to slash home. And we'll do something a little bit different here in a second. Okay, so now I have my modules page, my home page. Everybody impressed with this site? Nice, right? Okay, a little bit at a time. What I want to do here is I'm going to use Swig. Swig has a way of looping over data. Okay, the way that you loop over data is I'm going to say for module in modules. And for every module that I move over, now loop over, I'm going to grab that module and just grab its name, just for starters. So those are the 5 modules that I have here. Again, how did I end up getting them? I passed them through this second parameter, right? Which is when I render, templating engine takes that, and this is data that I could pass to the templating engine. So just to make it look a little bit nicer, I'm going to go over here. I'm going to make this an unordered list. Bootstrap has something called the list group. I'm going to end this. And again, you want to sort of use your indentation here. For each of these, this is going to be a list item. Class is going to be list group item. Again, this is, you can look at the documentation for Bootstrap. And now I'll get something that just looks a little bit prettier. Usually you get some oohs and ahs at this point, but I'm not going to tell you what to do. So what I want to do here is that when I end up doing this, I want to actually drill down a little further. Okay? So this is going to be an href that's now going to be dynamic, which is going to be my modules, this particular module.id. I'm going to go in here, and now if I do that and I click on this link, okay, again, I've got a route that doesn't exist. So I'm going to go back here. I'm going to go in here and I'm going to create a route for my modules. Now I've got a little bit of a different problem. Okay, I've got something that's dynamic that's coming in here. Okay, Express makes it very easy to do this. And again, this is happening earlier in the pipeline. Express goes and looks and sees what your route is, and you're able to put in a wildcard.
What do I mean by a wildcard? Well, this is going to be a slash, and I don't know exactly what it's going to be, but it's going to be an ID. Okay? Express goes, and once it ends up coming in here, I can actually access that ID by doing something like this. First of all, we're going to go to a detail page we'll call module. And in this case, I don't want to get all the modules. I just want to get one of them. But how do I get that ID? Well, Express is nice enough to give us, if there are any wildcards for this, it's going to give us params for an ID. It basically looks at the URL, says, all right, guy says he has an ID here. I see. There is an ID here. I'm going to match to this route. And now you can dynamically end up getting this. And I'm going to cheat a little bit here. And this is not get module. This is get modules. This is get module. All right, that was that code that I copied and pasted at the beginning. And I'm going to go over here and I'm going to cheat a little bit. And this is going to be my module. And I'm going to go over here just to sort of keep things a little simple. I'm going to go back to modules. And I'll say all modules. And I'll go over here and I'll say module. This is going to be the module, which is module.name. Start out with that. So now it should end up finding this route. And it finds the route, but it doesn't find my module. Reason why it doesn't find my module, and this kind of makes sense, is that if you look at my database code, and I end up calling get module, notice that it's got to be the exact ID. Okay, the module ID has to be the ID that's passed in here. Now, if you think about it for a second, these IDs that I have here are all numbers, right? But Express is not going to go and make an assumption to say, all right, I see that this is a number. I'm going to go and turn it into a number. So if we want to make sure that this ends up getting in here as a number, we're going to just turn it into a number. Sometimes you see plus. I just multiply by 1, turns it into a number. And now I've got my module for Express. So now I've got my detail page here. Actually, it's been a while. Why don't we actually git.add dot, git.commit, added pages, git.push. Okay? And let's go over here and let's specify that one of the things that we want to do, let's just show a little more data here. Just so we can see it. We'll put a div here. And we'll specify that this is the module's description. And we'll go over here and we'll put a line break. And we'll put a link. So this will be href, and this will be my module URL. And link to documentation, let's say. So if I do that, and by the way, right now if I did this, this would end up opening up in this particular tab. If I don't want it to open up in this tab, I could put a target here. This is just plain old HTML stuff that you don't know now, you'll get along the way. And this will end up doing something a little bit different where it'll actually open this up in a new tab so I could end up going back. All right? Well, so now I'm able to view my data. But what if I want to go and I want to add another module in here? Let's do one thing before we do that. I'm going to have a number of routes. Okay? These routes, when you see routes like this pattern of routes is called a RESTful route. Okay? So /modules shows you all the modules. /modules :ID shows you a single module. When we want to delete a module, instead of app.get, we're going to have app.delete. When we want to create a module, instead of saying app.get, we're going to do an app.post. Okay? One of the things you're going to see here is that if you have a big application with a bunch of different pages here, your server file is going to get huge. Okay? And we'd have a billion different routes in this file. Instead of doing that, Express allows us to do something allows us to create a router. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take this code, and I'm going to go up here, and I'm going to create a folder called routes. And I'm going to add to this a file called modules.js. Again, if you were doing a site with different products, you call this products.js. And I'm going to paste this code here. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to specify, hey, look, I've got an app, but it's not really an app. Express allows me to create a router. Okay? And I want to use this router in my other file. So I'm going to say module.exports equals app. Now, the only thing that I'm going to need here is notice that all these modules are always self-contained. So this module doesn't know about DB. Okay? If I tried to use it, it would give me an error and say, I don't really know what DB is. So I'm going to go over here and I'm going to specify, hey, look, DB is required. But don't forget, now I'm one level deeper, right? So I have to go up, DB. Now I'm going to use this router. And the way that I'm going to end up using this router is I'm going to go over here. I'm going to get rid of these two lines. And I'm going to go over here and I'm going to say app.use. And I'm going to say if anyone comes in with modules, look and see if you could find a matching route in require./routes modules. This is just a way of breaking your routes up so they're not all in one file. Okay? You don't want to have this huge file with every single route. You can have a lot of routes in your application. So Express gives you the ability. You can almost think about this as a little bit of a mini application, but you're able to set up your routes. So what I want to do here is now if I do this, I might think I'm in good shape when I do this, but I'm going to get a little bit of a problem here. Notice it says it can't get modules, but watch this. If I do modules 3, it'll find it. The reason why that's happening is that when I do something like this, I'm saying already, hey, look, if anything comes in with /modules, use this route, and this actually makes my life a little bit easier, because now this could just be /, and this could just be ID. Okay? Express is doing the work for me. Express is putting together the middleware. Express is seeing what route I'm matching, okay? And I'm handling the responses. So now, if I go back, this will end up working. Here's all modules. Here's a specific module. And let's look and see how we could end up creating a new module. So what I'm going to do here is on my views and on my modules page, right underneath the modules, I'm going to put a div. I'm going to give it a class of well. And I'm going to create a form. Now, if I'm creating something, I need to tell where I'm going to create it. And I'm going to go to modules. But when you create something, you don't have to do it this way, but it's expected with RESTful routes by convention. The method is going to be a post. And what I'm going to do is put in 3 form inputs here. Just so my form doesn't look terrible here, I'm going to use a little bit of Bootstrap magic here. This just gives me a little bit of room around my inputs, and I'm going to give this an input. I'm going to give this a class of form control. Again, this you'd get by looking at the documentation. I'm going to give this a name of name. And I'm going to do the same thing with my 3 other properties. I have a name, I have a description, and I've got a URL. And I'm also going to go over here and I'll give this another class of form group. Just gives me a little bit of padding. Again, I wouldn't be terribly concerned with the HTML. It doesn't have to look pretty at this point. And I'm going to put a button here. And I'm going to give this a class of BTN primary. It's going to give me a nice blue button. And and I'll say save. So if I go over here, and by the way, let's actually just do one other thing here. Right now, if I did this, and I go to all modules, I'll see my form, but I don't really know what each thing is. So I'm just going to, instead of putting in a label, I'm going to do a placeholder. Name, go over here, placeholder, description, placeholder, URL. Okay, and I'm going to put some stuff in here, and I'm going to do this, and when I click on save, what's going to happen is I can't post. That doesn't exist, and if I go over here and I look at that, it'll tell me, hey, look, you have a 404, but notice something. There is data that's going across the wire. Here's our, you can actually look at what's getting sent over the wire. Here's the form data that's being sent. In fact, it tells you that it's sent in URL decoded data. It actually even shows it to you. This is actually how it's going across. So by default, forms end up taking their data and they end up URL encoding it. Name, value, okay? Now, the key thing here is that what I want to do is I'm going to go back to my modules folder and I'm going to set up, this is not going to be a get, this is going to be a post. And what I'm going to attempt to do is to say db create module. Okay? Well, how do I get that data from my request object? Okay? Well, what you end up getting it with is something called the request.body. Now, a very common pattern for this is that when you end up posting to create data, okay, a post creates the data. And it's a very common pattern to do a post and then go back to the browser and say, hey, look, redirect back to another page. Okay? It's called a post get or a post redirect. Okay? This way, if someone refreshes the page, they don't get that annoying error message. Oh, do you want to post again? Do you want to post again? Do you want to post again? Okay? So very common pattern is to create and then do a response, redirect to module. So I could see that I ended up creating that module. I could refresh that page. Well, let's see what happens here. I'm going to go back here, go and try to put some stuff in. And I'm going to get some error messages, and it might be a little bit cryptic, but it says I can't read the property name of undefined. Reason why that's happening is that by default, Express says, I don't know what to do with data that you're sending over the wire. Okay? I know you could be sending me a payload, but I don't know what to do with it. Okay? You have to tell me what you want to do with it. And that's where another piece of middleware ends up coming in. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back up to my app, my server, and I'm going to use another piece of middleware. This middleware is going to be require body parser. All right? A little bit of a mouthful, but body parser ends up giving me a method called URL encoded. And since there are multiple ways to URL encode data, I don't want to get a message, I'll get a warning. So I'm going to say extended false, because there's different ways that you can end up encoding URL data. You can look at the different ways. I rarely have to end up running into this. It's pretty common, works for me. If I don't do this, I'll get a warning message. And if I do this now, and I go back here, and I go and I put some stuff in, and I save it, I'll now see it show up. Okay? So you need some sort of body parser. And by the way, data might come over the wire as JSON data. In fact, you would use the JSON method to do the body parsing. By default, an HTML form gets sent over as URL encoded data, and I'm being very specific with Express, and I'm saying, hey, look, if there is a request body there, I want you to decode it with a URL decoder. Now, the next thing that I want to do here is that what happens if someone goes over here and they click on save? Okay? Well, I've got an error message that says you need to put the name in, but this is not all that helpful. One of the things you could do here is all the way at the end of your middleware, or at the end of your server file, you could say app.use. And this is the first time that our middleware function that we create has another parameter called error. Request, response, next. So what'll happen here is if there's an error in our code, okay, it'll end up hitting this route. And when it hits this route, what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a special page for errors, response.render. Error doesn't exist yet. And what I'm going to do, so you can see the error, I'll put in error equals the error that I ended up getting here. Now, if I go to run this again and go back here and do this, okay, it'll say I can't find this template called error, and I'm going to put it in by going here. I'll call this error. And just to show you another Bootstrap style here, we'll go over here. And I'll put in a div, class, alert. There's an alert danger. And I'm going to get here if I have an error, so I'll just show that error. And I'll put a link here so you could get back to the main page if you want to. So now this is, granted, not the best error handling. I probably would want to do something a lot nicer, but serves our purpose for now. The last thing that I want to do here is I want to give the user the ability to delete a module. Okay? I want to give that delete functionality on the detail page. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go over here to my module page, and right on the bottom here inside this div, I'm going to put a button. I'm going to give it a class of btn, again, danger, so you don't just go and think it's a good thing to click, and I'll put delete. Now, what I want to do here is I want this to be a delete on the server. There's no real easy way to do this, but there is middleware that says, hey, look, if you do a post and you have a parameter in that post, you'll see what a parameter is, a URL parameter. If you have a URL parameter, okay, in that route that you call, and you end up putting underscore method in it, what I'm going to do on the server, even though you can't really do deletes from the client, the server will handle it and say, I know you really wanted to do a delete, and it'll call app.delete. And then we'll be able to have what are RESTful routes, right? We end up inserting, we do a post. If we had an update, we would end up doing a put. And when we have delete, we're going to do a delete. And that module's route is going to look very nice, but how do we get there? Well, what I need to do is a couple things. I'm going to put this in a form. I'm going to give this an action of /modules, and this is going to delete based on the module ID. I'm going to put a method of post, even though in the end it's not going to be post, and I'll show you how. Right now, by the way, well, before I do this, there's no matching route for this because there's no path. If I do this, and I go over here, go down to my modules, click on delete, there's no matching route, and I don't want that to be a post anyway, I want it to be delete. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to specify method equals delete. I can do that in caps, although it doesn't really matter one way or the other, I don't think. By the way, if I do this again, no difference. It's just going to give me this URL, but nothing's going to happen. So another piece of middleware. This is that method override middleware. And I'm going to put this middleware up here, app.use, require method override. And what this does is it says, hey, look, what parameter do you want me to use to find the right method on the URL? And I'm going to say, use the method parameter. Okay? Rest assured, every time that you see something like this in app.use, rest assured that that's giving me back a function.
Okay? That's going to be a function. That's part of the pipeline. Okay? If it's relevant because it sees an underscore method in the URL on a post, it'll only work on a post. If it sees an underscore method, it's going to say, instead of doing a post, I'm going to try to find delete. Because when you're deleting something, okay, you should have a route that's going to be a delete route. And this way you don't have to name your routes all kinds of crazy things like / modules underscore delete. Okay, and now if I go back here and I do this, it'll tell me that it can't find the route, but notice in fact that it's looking for a delete route. And now at this point, I can go over here, and I'm going to go back, and I'm going to go to my modules folder, and I'm going to put a delete. It looks sort of similar to my module route here, but this is going to be a delete. And I'm going to tell my DB to delete module. I'm going to have that same ID problem, request params ID. It's got to be an integer or else it won't delete it. And again, very similar to when you end up inserting something, I'm going to say response. By the way, if I deleted my module, there's nothing to see on this page anymore. So I'm going to say a response, redirect, and I'm going to redirect back to modules. If this works, we should be able to go in here. Here's all of our modules. Let's create a silly one here. Down here. And if we go and delete it, we should see that we go back here and it's gone. Now let me just show you one more thing and then I'm going to wrap this up. So first of all, let me go and git.add git.commit, added routes, okay, git.push, okay. Now I'm actually going to deploy it up to Heroku, okay. So I've got a couple of Heroku tools that are installed on my machine, but once you do that, I'm going to say Heroku create, and this is going to be my I love Node demo. Now it's going to give me a little bit of an error because Heroku, for whatever reason, doesn't like underscores. I don't know why. Must be a reason for it. So let's just change this. And I'm going to hit enter. It's going to create the application on Heroku. And I'm going to say, I want to git push to Heroku, my master branch. This actually is going and then pushing this up to my Heroku account. And if I actually go over here, here I am on the World Wide Web. Huh? Here are my modules. I always hate to give this URL out because then someone might curse in it or something and then it's stuck on my video, but hopefully you guys haven't gotten there fast enough and that's really about it. Anyway, that's going to do it for this demo. Let me just check my time here for a second to see if we could record some questions. Hey. Let me do one thing real quick. So this is stuff now. Let me just finish these slides. This is stuff you've seen, so I think it's going to be pretty easy. Okay? So we've seen all this stuff, how we can end up chaining handlers, how we can end up creating routers. So a little bit of a pop quiz, right? A client is going to be something that makes HTTP requests. A server is going to be something that responds to requests. A request is or at least an HTTP request is a formatted message sent over the network by a client. It contains a verb, a URL, any headers, and not always a body, but it could contain a body. The response is a server's reply, contains headers, payload, and status. In terms of the life cycle, the client is always the one that's initiating the request,
and the server completes it with the response. We've looked at Express middleware to end up creating our routes. Also, just another thing that we could end up doing here, we could pass data from our client to the server. We could end up doing it with a query parameter, in which case we didn't do this, but if we did it with a query parameter, we could access this by just saying request.query, in which case Express knows how to parse that URL because that's the only way that the URL could get encoded. And we could also pass a body, and in order to do this, we need to end up using some middleware. So request params are a variable portion of the URL. A router is a layer that ends up handling middlewares, and these are all things that you ended up seeing in the demo. So I know that people had a couple of questions, and we've got a couple of minutes. So go ahead. Wasif, right?
Yep.
Okay.
So I understand that the app.engine tells the browser server what engine to use to render the HTML.
Yeah, let's use our words. Let's just use our words a little carefully here. Okay. So we're talking about an Express app. Okay. So let's be a little bit more clear. Is that when we end up specifying the engine, what we're doing is we're adding an engine to Express. We're adding a templating engine to Express. And we're saying, hey, look, Express, we're adding the HTML engine to you, and the function that you're going to use to generate the template is going to be a function called swig render file. You can look at the swig render file function. It's going to take probably one string and some variables and marry them together. The other part of that is that we also have to say, hey, look, by default, we want to set our view engine to HTML. So we want you to use the HTML engine, but then we have to define the HTML engine, and we also have to create that HTML file in our folder.
So app.set needs to view engine HTML. That HTML there is sort of an arbitrary. I could have called it anything, and then I said HTML.
I don't think so, because I think you want it to look for a .html extension. If you called it foo, and you set an engine for foo with the swig.render file, my guess is it's going to look for an extension called index.foo. Right? But there are other templating engines. There's an EJS engine you could use. That's my guess. I'm not 100% positive of that.
So every time response render is called, it's actually running swig render file.
Whenever render is called, okay, it's using by default, it's going to look for an HTML page, and it's going to look for it's going to use this function, render file, to basically read the file, take the data, and it's letting swig do the work to create the template. And that's all happening on the server. That's important.
It's for the HTML. It's always create a views folder, or it's because you say it's view engine. If you
No, by default, you can set this. And I think in the workshop, it gets set manually, but by default,
it's views.
the templating engine looks in the views folder for most of these, so I don't bother putting it somewhere else. But if you wanted to, then you'd have to set it. And there's a way to set the folder as well.
For app.use,
Mhm.
does the position of it matters? Does
Sure,
it
absolutely.
have to be
Absolutely.
before app.get?
Well, it depends on when you want it to get called. If you
Okay.
wanted to call like a catch-all for a 404, you put app.use on the bottom, and you could have a custom 404 error. Okay? So it's the order is very, very important.
Second question. How come you call next in one of the app.use and didn't call next in all the other app.use?
Because the only time that I want to call next, I was just calling next here to demonstrate something. And what I'm getting at is you see that middleware that we have here that we've put in. Somewhere in that middleware, express.static and our body parser and our method override, they're calling next somewhere in there. So it's only when I want to go down to call something else as I end up calling next.
These callback functions, how do you remember what parameters it takes? Because it seems like error is always the first one.
There's
but
only
I see
two
that-
signatures. Two, that's it. Two signatures, okay? The normal signature for Express middleware,
3 parameters, request, response, and next. Okay? And then you could put a piece of middleware in there that handles error, which has 4 parameters. That's it. That's what you have to remember.
The app I use in your example, without the routing front end, that's capturing everything. Right?
That's exactly right. App.use basically says it's going to capture every single request.
I looked at
You asked a question already. No, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I looked at the similar frameworks like Angular, for example, and some people have seen code that they use app for their router, and some people say bar router.
Okay, now
That's arbitrary.
let's stop for a second. Right? And the reason why I want you to stop is that you're comparing 2 totally different things. Okay? When you talk about a framework like Angular, okay, Angular is happening on the client. Angular doesn't happen on the server. So they're 2 totally different technologies. If you said to me, I compared it to Ruby on Rails, then that could be a valid comparison.
No, it was actually just like an app that was built using Ruby stack.
Right, but it's important where the code ends up running, because if you say that, then maybe you're thinking that, you know, Angular is sort of like is analogous to Express, and they're really different things. But from a naming perspective, this is an app that we're building, but this is the server side part of the app.
So it's the where you define the router, where you will also call the router an app.
You know, I did that just so I didn't rename anything.
Okay.
I just didn't want to rename anything. Very often, I just was a little bit lazy here, and I think it's totally fine. When I look at the router, I look at it and I go like, you know what? To me, this is just sort of like a mini application. And you know, I also see, you know, sometimes if I was writing it from scratch, maybe I would call it router, but usually I'm copying and pasting it and putting it somewhere else. By the way, it's also very important to realize that, you know, it's very important that you end up exporting this router. If you don't export it, okay, when you load your application and you attempt to create the Angular pipeline, just to show this really fast, if I go over here and I forget to do this line, and you will at some point, I do, and I go back here, I'll see, hey, look, you got a problem. It says to me, because again, when my app runs, it's setting up that pipeline for me, okay? And it goes to run, and you said, hey, look, you told me /modules, you're going to give me some middleware for that, so I know what to do. You didn't give me anything. You didn't export anything. So it's important that you either have a function there, or that you have a router there, or some other piece of middleware. Okay? When I say middleware, middleware is always a function, okay? And it's always going to take that signature, request, response, next. Put that back in. Any other questions? That's it? All right. So let me stop recording this.